A black doctor was humiliated by a police officer, and she swore to take revenge. Days later, the police officer's son was admitted to the same hospital where the doctor worked, and that's where her revenge began. Elsa Martinez, a renowned surgeon, was known not only for her skill with a scalpel, but also for the calm and empathy with which she treated her patients. Her day had been exhausting. A complicated operation had drained all her energy. As she walked through the long hospital corridors, she felt the accumulated fatigue in her muscles, but also the satisfaction of having saved another life. This was her calling, her reason for being. But in moments like that, all she wanted was to get home and rest. The city's traffic was unforgiving, especially after a storm that had left the streets wet and slippery. As she drove, Elsa tried not to dwell on the condescending looks she had endured throughout her career. Being a black woman and a surgeon in a male-dominated world had forced her to face invisible barriers. She still remembered the racist comments she had heard as a student, the insinuations that her success was more due to luck than her own efforts. But Elsa had learned to hold her head high and keep moving forward. That night, the fog that covered the streets seemed like a perfect metaphor for her emotional state. As she thought about the surgery and her patient's life, a flash of blue and red lights pulled her out of her thoughts. A police checkpoint blocked the road, and there was no way around it. She took a deep breath and stopped her car. The officer who approached her window had a face hardened by life. Gregorio Olmedo didn't seem to be in the mood. His eyes darted around, quickly analyzing everything around him, looking for trouble where there might not be any. Without a word, he motioned for Elsa to roll down the window. "License and registration, please," Gregorio ordered in a deep voice. Elsa, used to situations like this, tried to stay calm. She knew she had followed all the rules, hadn't exceeded the speed limit, and her car was in perfect condition. "Of course, officer. Here you go," she replied, handing over her documents without hesitation. Gregorio took the papers and looked at them with disdain. Elsa watched as his eyes scanned her ID, and something in his expression changed. It wasn't a positive change. It seemed like a spark of prejudice had been ignited. "Coming from the hospital?" Gregorio asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yes, I'm a surgeon. I just finished a surgery," Elsa replied softly. "I see." Gregorio looked up, scanned her from head to toe, and let the silence stretch for a few uncomfortable seconds. "That explains the scrubs, but not your attitude." Elsa frowned, trying to understand what he meant. "My attitude? I'm just heading home after a long shift." "I don't understand what you mean." "It's always the same with you people," Gregorio muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "You think you can do whatever you want because you have titles or positions of power. But not with me." Elsa's heart started to beat faster. She knew that tone all too well. She had heard it before, from others, in other moments. The simmering anger from years of facing similar situations began to bubble up inside her, but she forced herself to stay composed. She didn't want to make things worse. "Officer, I'm complying with all the rules. My papers are in order. If there's an issue with the car, I can fix it right now." Gregorio stared at her, his face unmoving, but something stirred within him. There was a deep resentment that, for reasons he didn't fully understand, he took out on people like Elsa. His job had hardened him, and the disappearance of his wife had filled him with a quiet hatred that he often unleashed on the most vulnerable. "You know you've got a taillight out?" Gregorio said, though he knew it wasn't true. "That's not possible. I checked it recently," Elsa replied, unable to keep a note of disbelief from creeping into her voice. Gregorio stepped closer to the car, leaning in to get a better look at her. "Are you calling me a liar?" The tension in the air was palpable. The cars behind Elsa began to honk their horns, but neither of them moved. Time seemed to freeze in that silent standoff, where it wasn't just words, but also everything left unsaid. Gregorio's eyes, full of disdain, never left hers, and Elsa felt a mix of anger and helplessness burning inside her. "I didn't say that," Elsa replied, her voice as controlled as she could make it. I'm just saying I always make sure my car is in perfect condition. Gregorio stared at her for a long moment before slapping the roof of the car with an open hand. An aggressive, provocative gesture. You seem to have an excuse for everything, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That's the problem with people like you. Elsa felt something inside her break. People like you. Those words hit her harder than any insult could. Her breathing quickened, and she had to make a conscious effort to stay calm. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose her temper. I don't know what you mean by people like me, but if there's no real reason to stop me, I'd like to be on my way, officer, she said firmly. Gregorio smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, disdainful. Not so fast. I want to search the car. Elsa gripped the steering wheel tightly, struggling to maintain control. She knew there was no reason for him to search her car, and she knew this was nothing more than a show of power, an attempt to make her feel small. But she also knew that confronting him in that moment would only make things worse. Do what you need to do, she said, her voice controlled, but her eyes reflecting the anger she held back. Gregorio walked around the car, inspecting every detail, taking his time, relishing the discomfort he caused. Elsa watched him from the driver's seat, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to scream, wanted to let him know she wouldn't be humiliated, but she knew this wasn't the time or place. She had learned, over the years, to pick her battles. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Gregorio returned to the window. Everything seems to be in order, he said, not bothering to hide the frustration in his voice. Elsa took a deep breath, knowing the battle wasn't over yet. Can I go now? She asked calmly. Gregorio looked at her one last time, as if deciding whether to prolong the abuse of power or let her go. This time, yes, he replied, tossing her documents through the window carelessly. But next time, I won't be so lenient. Elsa gathered her papers without a word, started the engine, and drove away slowly. As she moved away from the checkpoint, the tears she had been holding back began to fall. They weren't tears of sadness, but of anger and helplessness. Anger at having to face racism, discrimination, and abuse of power once again. Helplessness at knowing that, in that moment, there was nothing she could do to change what had just happened. When she finally arrived at her apartment, she collapsed onto the couch. The city lights flickered through the window, and the sound of rain hitting the glass was the only thing breaking the silence. Elsa closed her eyes, trying to calm her breathing. She knew that, as so many times before, she would have to find a way to move forward, to not let people like Gregorio bring her down. Meanwhile, Gregorio returned to his patrol car. He sat in the driver's seat, started the engine, but didn't move. Something about the encounter with Elsa had left him uneasy. He didn't understand why, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. He had seen that kind of look before, the look of someone who has endured more than they should. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He didn't have time to dwell on this. He had other matters to attend to, other problems to solve. But as he drove away from the checkpoint, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see something more. The next day, the constant noise of the medical monitors was the only thing breaking the silence in the room. The cold hospital lights illuminated Lucas Olmedo's pale face, still unconscious in the bed. His body bore the obvious signs of the accident that had brought him there. Cuts on his forehead, a cast on his arm, and assisted breathing. Elsa Martinez, the same surgeon who had been humiliated by his father, was now by his side, watching him with a mixture of professionalism and humanity. When Elsa realized that the young man on her operating table was the son of the officer who had mistreated her just a few hours earlier, she felt as if the world was playing a cruel joke on her. The weight of the moral dilemma she faced had kept her awake the night before. She knew her duty was to save him, regardless of who his father was. She had done it, but now, as Lucas lay motionless, she felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. Suddenly, The door to the room opened. The tired and remorseful face of Gregorio Olmedo appeared at the threshold. Elsa noticed how he hesitated before entering, his eyes fixed on his son, but he finally approached the bed slowly. He couldn't hide the tremor in his hands as he touched Lucas's casted arm. "Lucas," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, son." Elsa watched him from the corner of the room, her presence uncomfortable for both of them. She felt the need to say something but couldn't find the right words. The emotional tension from the previous day still weighed heavily on her chest, but she decided to take the first step. "Your son is going to be fine," Elsa said softly but firmly, not allowing her own resentment to interfere with the moment. Gregorio looked up, and for the first time in a long while, his gaze didn't reflect arrogance or contempt. There was a hint of vulnerability that Elsa had never imagined seeing in him. "Thank you," he murmured, unable to hold her gaze for long. The silence between them stretched on. Elsa knew she should leave, that her work was done, but something in the air kept her anchored to that place. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, and both were aware of it. Gregorio felt trapped between gratitude and shame, while Elsa searched her mind for something to release them from the discomfort. "Yesterday," Gregorio began, hesitating before continuing. "Yesterday, I was a jerk." Elsa looked at him, surprised. She hadn't expected an apology. Her silence encouraged him to go on. "There's no excuse for what I did. What I said." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I'm not like that, or at least, I didn't used to be." Elsa took a deep breath, deciding how to respond. She knew Gregorio's apology wouldn't change what had happened, but there was something in his tone that revealed a more complicated story. "We all have bad days, officer," she finally said, without fully committing. "What matters is that we learn from them." Gregorio nodded, unsure of how to continue. The relief of his son's successful surgery was overshadowed by guilt. But before he could say anything more, the door opened again, and a nurse hurried in. "Doctor, the patient's test results have arrived." Elsa took the papers handed to her and began to read. Her face, calm until then, started to harden as she went through the results. Something was off. The levels of certain substances in Lucas's blood didn't match those of a typical accident. "What's wrong?" Gregorio asked, noticing the change in her expression. Elsa hesitated before responding, aware that what she was about to say could complicate things. "The test shows that your son had a significant amount of barbiturates in his system." She looked Gregorio directly in the eyes. "Those levels aren't accidental." Gregorio froze. He didn't understand. Barbiturates? Lucas wasn't the kind of kid who got involved with drugs. How could that be possible? No, that's impossible. Lucas doesn't take that kind of stuff. He's never been like that, Gregorio replied, unable to process what he had just heard. Elsa looked at him seriously. She knew how hard it was to accept something like this, but the evidence was there. Those results pointed to something more than a simple car accident. "Gregorio, I know this is hard to accept, but those levels don't just appear by chance. It's possible that Lucas was under a lot of pressure, or maybe he was trying to escape from something." The words "escape from something" hit Gregorio like a slap. He had been an absent father, focused on his own pain and work, and had completely missed the signs his son might have been sending. Their relationship had been cold for years, and at that moment, he realized how much damage he had caused with his indifference. "Lucas, he never told me anything. He never showed any signs of being upset," Gregorio murmured, almost to himself, as if trying to convince himself that he hadn't failed as a father. Elsa watched as guilt began to consume Gregorio. For a moment, she felt a spark of compassion. She knew what it was like to carry the weight of past decisions, and although he had been cruel to her, she couldn't deny that, in this moment, he was a father facing the worst fear. Discovering that his son had been suffering in silence. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us, Elsa said, trying to soften the blow of reality. But what's important now is that he has a chance. He's alive, and with the right help, he can get through this. Gregorio nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. As Elsa's words washed over him, he began to remember small details, moments he had overlooked. The calls from Lucas he never returned, the conversations he always postponed because he was too busy. What if all of that had contributed to his son making such a desperate choice? "I need to be alone with him," Gregorio said suddenly, his voice firmer. "Please." Elsa understood the pain behind his words. She knew that Gregorio needed time to process what was happening, and it wasn't her place to interrupt that process. With one last glance at Lucas, she turned and left the room, leaving Gregorio in his emotional storm. As she left the hospital, Elsa felt a whirlwind inside her. The day had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Lucas's face remained in her mind, young, injured, but with a life still ahead of him. And then there was Gregorio, a man who had been cruel, but who was now facing the horror of realizing his son was more broken than he had imagined. Inside the room, Gregorio sat next to Lucas, watching the steady rhythm of the monitor mark his son's fragile breathing. He had failed as a father, and that reality hit him hard. He moved closer to his son and, for the first time in years, let the tears flow freely. "I'm sorry, Lucas. I shouldn't have been so hard on you. I shouldn't have distanced myself from you," he whispered, his voice breaking with sobs. "I can't lose you too." The words came out between sobs, and for a moment, Gregorio let down the strong man's armor he had worn for so long. There, beside his unconscious son, he allowed himself to feel the guilt, the pain, and the fear. Fear that it might already be too late to fix things. Meanwhile, in the hospital corridors, Elsa made her way to her office, her mind on the words she had spoken. She knew that Lucas was at a turning point, but she also knew there were secrets in that family that had yet to come to light. And although she didn't want to get more involved than necessary, something told her this story was only just beginning. The hospital seemed quieter than usual. Elsa walked through the corridors with the echo of her own thoughts bouncing in her mind. The results of Lucas's tests had left her feeling uneasy. The image of Gregorio's face, devastated by guilt and surprise, was etched in her memory. She knew that, as a doctor, her job ended once the patient was stabilized. However, something kept her connected to that family, to those secrets she sensed but didn't fully understand yet. Lucas remained unconscious in the room, his body resting while his mind fought between life and death. Gregorio hadn't moved from his son's side since Elsa had left the room, and his thoughts continued to torment him. The image of his son lying in that bed dragged him into a spiral of guilt from which he couldn't escape. "What didn't I see?" he asked himself over and over, as his gaze drifted to the ceiling of the room. But deep in his heart, he knew the answer. He had distanced himself from Lucas long before his wife disappeared, long before his life became a series of wrong decisions and emotional walls. He had allowed the pain to turn him into a cold and authoritarian man, incapable of hearing his son's silent cry for help. As Gregorio was lost in his thoughts, a nurse entered with a folder in her hand. Her face showed concern, as if she wasn't sure whether she should deliver what she was carrying. "Officer Olmedo, I have here the results of some additional tests that Dr. Martinez ordered," said the nurse, her voice hesitant. "You should take a look at this." Gregorio frowned. He wasn't expecting more news, and his heart began to pound in his chest. "Leave them there. I'll look at them later," he replied, trying to keep his composure. "It would be best if you looked at them now, sir," insisted the nurse, placing the papers on a small table beside the bed. Gregorio, unable to bear the tension, took the documents and began to read. As he progressed through the report, His expression hardened until his face became completely disoriented. Elsa had ordered more in-depth toxicology tests. The results confirmed that Lucas had been consuming barbiturates for longer than they had imagined. But that wasn't the most shocking part. There were traces of a dangerous substance, a combination of medications that didn't correspond to anything recreational or accidental. That mixture was something much darker. Gregorio closed his eyes, trying not to think about what those results suggested. He was trying to avoid the inevitable. Lucas might have been trying to take his own life. He felt the air grow thick and heavy, as if everything around him was beginning to collapse. How had his son reached this point without him realizing? How had he allowed their relationship to deteriorate so much? Just then, the door opened and Elsa entered the room. She had checked Lucas's medical chart and decided to visit the patient again, concerned about Gregorio's emotional state. "Is everything all right?" Elsa asked, noticing Gregorio's expression as he held the test results in his hand. Gregorio looked up, his eyes clouded with confusion and fear. "No, it's not all right. My son tried to?" He couldn't finish the sentence. The words caught in his throat. Elsa approached slowly, feeling the weight of the situation. It was a delicate moment, and anything she said could either ignite or extinguish a flame that Gregorio had been harboring for years. "The results suggest that Lucas has been under great emotional pressure," she responded carefully. "The amount of barbiturates in his system indicates this wasn't just a simple accident, but we don't know for sure what his intentions were." Gregorio dropped the papers onto the table and sat in the chair next to Lucas's bed, burying his face in his hands. He couldn't handle the possibility that his son might have tried to commit suicide. He had thought that Lucas was dealing with his own problems, but he never imagined that he was so broken. "All of this is my fault," Gregorio said in a low, almost inaudible voice. "I pushed him to this." Elsa felt a knot in her stomach. She had seen this kind of situation before. Parents facing the harsh realities of their failed relationships with their children, blaming themselves for every mistake, every distance they had allowed to grow between them. But with Gregorio, there was something more. Something that hadn't yet come to light. Something Elsa sensed but didn't fully understand. "Gregorio," Elsa began, "you can't blame yourself for everything. Sometimes, the people we love feel lost for reasons that go beyond our understanding. What's important now is that you're here for him, to support him." Gregorio lifted his gaze and locked eyes with her, his eyes full of desperation. "You don't understand, doctor. I didn't just abandon him emotionally. I abandoned my family long before all of this happened." Elsa felt the air in the room grow even heavier. There was something in Gregorio's voice that made her think he was about to reveal something important. She decided to listen, waiting for him to continue. "Everything changed after my wife disappeared," Gregorio said, his voice cracking as he mentioned the name he hadn't spoken in so long. I was never the same after that. I became a shadow of who I used to be. And Lucas, he felt it too. I lost my wife, and at the same time, I lost my son." Elsa remained silent, waiting for Gregorio to continue. "For years, I thought it was an accident, that she just disappeared." He continued, his words loaded with painful truth. "But recently, I found out something I can't ignore anymore." Gregorio stood up, walking towards the window, staring at the dark, starless sky. Then, he turned to Elsa with a look that said it all. "My wife didn't disappear. She was murdered." Elsa felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Gregorio's words hit like a bomb, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. The idea that Gregorio's wife had been murdered and not simply disappeared completely changed the dynamics of the situation. There was a much darker secret within that family, a truth Gregorio had been hiding. How do you know?" Elsa asked cautiously. "A few weeks ago, I found evidence. Something buried in old police files." Gregorio took a deep breath before continuing. And I know who killed her. Elsa stared at him, incredulous. Who was it? She asked, fearing the answer. Gregorio looked her straight in the eye, his expression filled with a mix of anger and resignation. My own partner in the police force. He was involved in a corruption ring, and my wife had discovered something she wasn't supposed to. She never told me, but she investigated on her own. She paid the price with her life. The weight of those words dropped like an anvil in the room. Elsa felt that the truth was finally surfacing, but it only added more tension and danger to the situation. Gregorio, this is serious. Have you reported this? Elsa asked, aware that what he was revealing could have catastrophic consequences. I can't, Gregorio replied, clenching his fists. If I do, they'll kill us all. It's no longer just about my wife. Now I know that Lucas is in danger too, and I can't risk his life. Elsa realized they were entangled in something far bigger than she had ever imagined. There was a real danger looming over that family, and now she was involved too. The fear in Gregorio's eyes wasn't just for his son's life. It was for his own as well. The atmosphere in the room became almost unbearable. Elsa knew she was in the middle of something she couldn't control, something beyond her medical and professional ethics. Now, there was a life at stake, and not just Lucas's. Gregorio, we need to find a way to protect Lucas, Elsa said firmly. You can't do this alone. Gregorio nodded, knowing she was right, but also fully aware that any wrong move could be their last. The tension in the air was palpable. Elsa walked through the hospital corridors with a knot in her stomach, Gregorio's words echoing in her mind. She knew she was in dangerous territory. The revelation that Gregorio's wife had been murdered and that his own police partner was involved in a corruption ring changed everything that had happened so far. The underlying fear for Lucas's safety, combined with the fact that Gregorio knew too much, put the entire family in a precarious position. When she reached Lucas's room, Elsa stopped at the door. Gregorio was at his side, watching every movement his son made. Gregorio's eyes were dull, filled with an exhaustion that came not only from the hours spent by Lucas's bedside, but from the weight of the secrets he had kept for so long. He turned slightly when he sensed Elsa's presence. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this, Gregorio said quietly, not taking his eyes off his son. Every second that passes, I feel like someone is watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Elsa took a step toward the bed, but before she could respond, Lucas began to move. Slowly, his eyes opened, still disoriented but aware that something had changed. Gregorio immediately leaned toward him. Lucas, can you hear me? Gregorio asked urgently. Lucas blinked, confused, but nodded weakly. Elsa stepped closer, checking his vital signs while exchanging glances with Gregorio. They both knew this moment would change everything. Where am I? Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. You're in the hospital, son. You had an accident, Gregorio replied with a tone of relief. You're safe. Lucas tried to process what they were telling him, but a shadow of sadness crossed his face. Elsa noticed and leaned gently toward him. Lucas, do you remember anything before the accident? She asked cautiously, not wanting to overwhelm him. For a moment, Lucas seemed to struggle internally. The confusion and pain in his eyes were evident, but little by little, the memory of the events began to return. His breathing became heavier, and he looked at his father with a mix of fear and shame. It wasn't an accident, Lucas said, barely above a whisper. Lucas's words fell like a hammer in the room. Gregorio froze. The pain in his chest intensified as he heard his son admit what he had feared. Elsa remained calm, but she knew this moment was crucial. Lucas, you can talk to us, Elsa said in a soft and reassuring voice. We're here to help you. What happened? Tears began to fill Lucas's eyes. He felt trapped in a web of emotions, unable to find a way out. After what seemed like minutes of torturous silence, he finally spoke. I couldn't take it anymore, he admitted, his voice breaking. Everything was too much. I felt like I was drowning. Mom was gone, and you. He looked at Gregorio. You were never there. You always cared more about your work than me. I felt like I didn't matter. I didn't know what else to do. Gregorio recoiled, as if his son's words had physically struck him. The pain in his eyes was clear, but he said nothing. He knew that any explanation he tried to give wouldn't change the truth. He had failed as a father. Elsa remained silent, allowing this delicate moment to unfold between father and son. Lucas, I never wanted you to feel that way, Gregorio said, his voice breaking. I was lost. After what happened to your mother, I didn't know how to handle anything. It wasn't your fault. None of this was your fault. Everything changed after Mom disappeared, Lucas said, now openly crying. No one ever told me what happened. And you pushed me away. I just wanted to know the truth. Where is Mom? Why don't we ever talk about her? Lucas's question cut through the air like a knife. Gregorio knew this moment would come, but he still wasn't prepared to face it. He couldn't hide the truth any longer. Lucas, your mother didn't disappear. She was murdered, Gregorio finally said, his voice breaking. I've been investigating her death for years, and I discovered that one of my colleagues in the police was involved. Lucas looked at him, incredulous. Why didn't you ever tell me? I thought it was better to protect you. I was afraid they'd hurt you too. I believed that if I kept you away from all of this, you'd be safe. Lucas's face hardened at his father's words. Protect me? By pushing me away? Don't you see that it made things worse? All this time I've been living a lie, not knowing what happened to Mom. I deserve to know the truth. Elsa watched the intensity of the exchange, aware that the conversation was reaching a point of no return. But before she could intervene, a loud knock was heard at the door. The nurse rushed in, her face pale. Officer Olmedo, there's a man here. He says he's with the police, but his behavior is strange. He's demanding to see you and the patient. Gregorio immediately stood up, fear flooding his face. He knew what that meant. It's him, he whispered, looking at Elsa. He's here to finish what he started. Elsa's heart began to race. The tension in the room skyrocketed. She knew that, in that moment, everyone's lives were in danger. Gregorio turned to Lucas, who was looking at him with terror in his eyes. I won't let them hurt you, Gregorio promised. But you have to trust me now. Gregorio quickly moved toward Elsa and grabbed her arm. I need you to get him out of here. Right now. There's no time to wait. Elsa, though scared, nodded. She knew they couldn't stay in that room a second longer. Carefully, she helped Lucas out of bed. Though still weak, fear drove him to move. This way, Elsa said, guiding them toward a back exit of the hospital that few people knew about. She knew they had to escape before the man chasing them reached them. As they hurried through the empty corridors, the sound of footsteps grew closer. Gregorio drew his gun from its holster and turned to face whoever was following them. He knew he couldn't run forever. He had to confront his past. Keep moving, he shouted to Elsa, without taking his eyes off the end of the hallway. I'll catch up with you. Elsa couldn't stop thinking about the absurdity of the situation. Just a few hours ago, she had been a doctor busy with her everyday life, and now she was fleeing alongside a desperate father and a wounded son, all trapped in a web of secrets and danger. As they ran, a gunshot rang out. Elsa stopped in her tracks, her heart in her throat. Gregorio, she screamed, turning back. But what she saw was heartbreaking. Gregorio lay on the ground, his body motionless. The man who had attacked him, his former partner, stood over him with a malicious grin. But before he could take another step, hospital security arrived, and the attacker was subdued. Elsa ran to Gregorio, tears streaming down her face. She knelt beside him, checking his pulse. It was weak, but still beating. Don't let Lucas live in the shadow of the past, Elsa, Gregorio whispered with difficulty, as his gaze became more and more distant. Elsa looked into his eyes, understanding the weight of his words. She knew this was his final request, and she had to fulfill it. As the paramedics arrived to take Gregorio away, Elsa took Lucas's hand. "Your father loved you more than you realized," she said softly, "and he wanted to protect you. But now it's your turn to choose your own path." Lucas, still in shock from everything that had happened, looked at Elsa with a mix of sadness and understanding. He knew that the truth he had been searching for had come at a great cost, but he also understood that amidst the tragedy, he had the chance to rebuild his life. The price of truth had been high. Gregorio had paid with his life, but he left behind a crucial lesson. It was never too late to change, to face the past, and to seek redemption. The hospital buzzed with the chaos of the emergency. Paramedics worked quickly over Gregorio's body, trying to stabilize him. Elsa, still standing beside Lucas, watched as the scene unfolded before her, feeling the tension in every fiber of her being. Seconds stretched into hours as Gregorio fought for his life. Despite the gunshot, the doctors managed to stop the bleeding in time. After a long and exhausting procedure in the operating room, the doctors confirmed that Gregorio had survived, but the bullet had caused severe damage to his spine. The diagnosis was clear. Gregorio would be paralyzed from the waist down. Hours later, as Gregorio lay in a bed in the ICU, Elsa and Lucas sat in the waiting room, processing everything that had happened. Lucas was still in shock from the attack and the revelation about his mother. Elsa, on the other hand, knew there was more to uncover. The most important question remained. Why had Gregorio's attacker, his former partner, gone to such lengths? It was then that a police officer approached, his face serious but with a hint of relief. "We have the man who tried to kill Gregorio," he announced. "He's in custody, and during the interrogation, he revealed more than we expected." Elsa and Lucas exchanged nervous glances. They knew the answers were coming, but they weren't sure if they were ready to hear them. "What did he say?" Lucas asked, his voice tense. The officer took a deep breath before continuing. "The man who attacked him was a former partner of your father, just as he told you. For years, he was involved in a corrupt police ring that operated in the shadows, protecting drug trafficking and other crimes in the city." The officer paused, gauging Lucas and Elsa's reactions before continuing. "Your mother, Gregorio's wife, discovered this network by accident. She found incriminating documents and evidence that exposed several officers, including your father's partner." Lucas closed his eyes tightly, trying to contain the storm of emotions crashing over him. "When your mother tried to take the evidence to the authorities, your father's partner found out and decided to silence her. For years, Gregorio suspected that his wife's disappearance wasn't accidental, and in the end, he was able to confirm what he feared. She was murdered to cover up the corruption." Elsa felt a lump in her throat. Everything was starting to make sense. Gregorio had carried that truth for years, not knowing how to protect his family or how to act directly. The weight of that truth had transformed him, consumed him, and driven him to distance himself from his son. "Why did he attack now?" Elsa asked. "If so many years have passed, why do it now?" The officer looked at her seriously. Gregorio, in his attempt to redeem himself and seek justice for his wife, had gathered evidence about the corruption. He was ready to expose everything. We know he had started sharing that information with prosecutors and journalists. He was so close to dismantling the entire corrupt system that those involved felt they couldn't wait any longer. Lucas lowered his head, processing the fact that his mother had died seeking justice, and that his father, in his own pain, had tried to follow in her footsteps, even if it was too late. "But he survived," Lucas said quietly, not knowing if he was saying it to himself or to the others. "Even though he's paralyzed now, he's still alive. That has to mean something." Elsa put a hand on Lucas's shoulder, feeling the need to offer some comfort. "Your father went through a lot. He wasn't perfect, but he tried to make up for his mistakes. Now it's your turn to decide what to do with that truth. He still has a chance to redeem himself, And so do you, Lucas." The young man nodded slowly, knowing Elsa was right. Despite everything that had happened, both he and his father were still alive, and that was the most important thing at that moment. He had a chance to heal, to rebuild a relationship that had been broken by years of lies and secrets. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. Hours later, Elsa and Lucas went to see Gregorio, who was awake in his bed, though visibly weakened. The surgery had been successful, but the paralysis was permanent. Gregorio observed his new condition with a mix of acceptance and resignation. "I'm sorry, Lucas," Gregorio said as soon as he saw his son, his voice soft and tired. "I failed you, your mother, you. Everything I did was to protect you, but in the end, I left you alone." Lucas, without saying a word, approached his father and took his hand. It was the first time in a long time that Gregorio felt this closeness with his son, and though sadness consumed him, something inside him eased. "I can't change the past, Dad. I can't bring Mom back," Lucas said, his eyes filled with tears. "But I don't want to lose you too." Gregorio couldn't hold back the tears. He had spent so much time avoiding feeling, carrying the guilt, that now, in his fragility, everything broke. The barriers he had built over the years crumbled all at once. "Thank you, son," Gregorio whispered, gripping Lucas's hand tightly. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Elsa, watching from the corner of the room, felt something close within her as well. She had witnessed a family tragedy that had touched her more than she expected. She had entered their lives as a doctor, but now she felt part of their story, bound to them by the invisible threads of fate. As she left the hospital that night, the cold city air enveloped her. She looked up at the sky, searching for stars, but the blanket of clouds had hidden them. Despite everything, Elsa felt a slight glow inside her, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Gregorio had survived, Lucas would have a second chance, and the truth had finally come to light. She had learned, once again, that life was full of pain and tragedy, but also moments of redemption and second chances. And as she walked toward her car, Elsa knew that although Gregorio and Lucas's story wasn't over, the first step toward healing had been taken. What did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep posting exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We truly appreciate having you here with us, and you can click on the links that are popping up on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Take care.